Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what is the last stream session of PID Awareness Week. We do have a community of practice tomorrow, so if someone would like to attend and is not a member as yet, please reach out to us and we're happy to send the link to you. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce Kate Peterson from Ombudsman, who will be discussing trauma-informed practices to avoid psychological injury in the Speak Up culture. Please make a warm welcome to Kate. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I wanted to start just by providing an acknowledgement of country. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, for the place that we meet today. For tens of thousands of years, this location was a pristine coastline with food and resources for the people and traditional owners. Some of the main thoroughfares, King Street in Newtown, Oxford Street, George Street, are the traditional routes that those custodians used for trade and communication, and we are lucky enough to be here today as a cultural and gathering hub for the conversation in PID Awareness Week. So I just take that moment to say my gratitude for being able to gather here, and also respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. So in terms of my own standing to be here and speak to you about this topic today, it's been great to be invited to be part of PID Awareness Week, and I know that this initiative on the part of the Ombudsman is reflected in different activities in different agencies and organisations across the public sector, that it is an initiative to build up that speak up climate, that public ethos of integrity, and also grapple with the difficulties and the challenges and the implementation issues associated with that ambition of good government and a public interest regime that brings the problems to the surface. So from my point of view, there are three things that sort of really jump out. One is the connection to an audience of people who really hold that responsibility of good governance and advocating in the public interest meaningfully and close to their heart. Secondly, that we might be able to spark some conversations about more upstanders and bystanders and building that package of culture around individual disclosures. And I'll circle on this a bit, but I think one of the great things about this initiative is trying to think beyond the idea of the heroic whistleblower, the one-out person that has the broad shoulders or some immense sense of purpose or character to stick their head up, but rather think about it as a community and culture that says that the responsibility of advocating for the public interest involves this responsibility of asking difficult questions, of disclosing uncomfortable truths, of questioning whether serious wrongdoing is taking place. And then thirdly, to build connections between different agencies. Obviously, we're greatly indebted to the Ombudsman for hosting and bringing these initiatives forward. I've seen the other sessions during the week, bringing together people from different agencies, looking at the data from the reporting that goes up about PIDs and trends and things emerging from that. So that opportunity to build connection is really valuable for all of us. So in terms of speaking about handling PIDs, to call out the elephant in the room, I'm not a public servant. I'm not part of the government infrastructure. Why am I a person that might be listened to on this front? So one of the specialties in my legal practice has been handling these kind of complaints externally for government agencies. So I've easily sort of led more than 100 different investigations of different types of wrongdoing or allegations in the public sector, and been specialised in that for at least 10 years or so. Going back a little further, I'm the child of lifelong public servants. I'm a child of the 1980s whose public servant parents thought that a good thing in primary school was to sit in front of the budget and listen to it, because that was part of being a good citizen and understanding your place in the world. And I've worked as a public servant in the past. I've taught government international relations at the University of Sydney. It is a passion and a real commitment that goes back to those childhood days. So the topic that I've been asked to speak on today is around trauma-informed practice to avoid psychological injury in a speak-up culture. And I'm a practicing lawyer. One lens on that is the types of legal claims related to psychological injury and the harm that can be experienced by people at work. So that's my agenda and the talking points that I'll go through today. And I wanted to start by making that very real. So we are here engaged in PID Awareness Week. The people joining online and in the room are leading the way in terms of thinking about probity, integrity, and those types of matters. So I want each of you to think of the worst, most egregious, unsettling thing you have seen in your lives and careers in the public service. I want you to turn back and unfortunately many of you will have something that comes to mind. The most worrying thing that gave you night sweats, that gave you visions of Senate estimate grillings on the matter, that gave you horror about vulnerable people or customers or clients of your agency being impacted, that worst moment. And if I were to ask each of you that's called that to mind to just come up and tell everyone about it, I doubt that we'd have many takers. Now, that's a pretty stylised abstraction of what we're talking about, but when we talk about public interest disclosures, a lot of the time that's what we're asking people to do, to step forward and articulate that type of matter. And so that sort of silly invitation to tell all today to this big audience immediately highlights that we're tasked with setting an environment and culture and tone that enables people to speak. And so we could easily make that a much more inviting invitation. So if we took everyone else out of the room and it was just you and me, we'd probably improve things. If I explained what my role was and why I was asking, if I explained that my purpose was to listen and that you should tell me how we could best have a conversation that would be effective, we can start really easily to build up all of the things that will create a safe space for that conversation. And many of those things will immediately jump to mind. So in broaching this topic today, I think that's just a useful kind of aid memoir to think about. That's what we're asking people to do. So when we ask them to take that step, what we are really doing is inviting them to go through sort of 4 stages. The first is to perceive that wrongdoing at all. So to have the capability and the understanding from an education and awareness point of view to know the line in terms of serious wrongdoing, maladministration, public interest type matters. And all of us would be familiar with those as abstract definitions, but we need to build a kind of lived and breathed experience across the public service where that gut feeling of where is the line is actually really robust, that perception is sound. The second thing is that we need that person to see a supportive culture and framework around those concerns. And a lot of that comes from the scaffolding of the legislation that we have, the institutions that we have around the Public Interest Disclosure Act and the internal processes in agencies. They need to see a framework, but that scaffolding is just the start of the picture, right? We need that to be actually a culture and an environment that invites trust. We need that person to assess the downsides of the disclosure. We need to be real about that it's not a situation where that will be a good day in the office and a unqualified lightening of their load, that there will be challenges and downsides to that. And that when they do that, they have that level of trust that the public interest will prevail and that they'll have an experience of respect, listening, and meaningful remedy if that's the ultimate conclusions of a process. So we think about somebody taking those 4 steps. There's some obvious psychological risks that you can see in navigating that, right? So obviously I'm not a clinician or a specialist in terms of the psychological causation and risk, but we can think about feelings of isolation, feelings of distrust, that you're looking around an institution that you believe in, questioning what's going on. feelings of vigilance or vulnerability about yourself. If I start calling out other people, I'm going to be under the microscope or questioned or trawled for my own errors. The stress and anxiety of what to do, the potential for rumination about what's this going to mean. Once I let this information be on my mind, the cat's out of the bag, what kinds of consequences might I experience? So we can very easily build up a very vulnerable and stressful, psychologically challenging moment around that decision about disclosure. And that's something that many of you with an interest in this area don't have to look far to see stories of whistleblowers, whether they're in corporate spheres or in government, talking about that personal load and experience. And there's some really harrowing stories that we have access to from public coverage of those matters. So that's the crystallising of some risk factors. In the talk today, I've been invited to talk about psychological injury and when that might crystallise into something that we can better understand. So the reason for doing that is, unfortunately, that the data for New South Wales Government shows that it is a significant and increasing experience for public servants to have a psychological injury associated with work. There are different ways to measure that or gauge it, but in the last sort of 4-year reporting period from iCare, for example, there's been a 30% increase in psychological claims made under workers' compensation. The average cost and time off work for those claims is 3 times a physical claim. So the likelihood that you will be rehabilitated, return to work and have a successful return is much lower. And when we compare government to the private sector, there's also a stark difference. So in the last reporting period, the iCare numbers indicate there are 1.5 psychological claims per 1,000 private sector workers, and the equivalent number in New South Wales Government is 11.5. So a 10x comparison for these kinds of claims. Now, this is in relation to work in general. We know there is a lot of caring work, emergency work, frontline activity in government that can explain a significant part of that. But certainly the data suggests that in those claims processes, we're seeing people harmed by coming to work and their experiences. And the number one reason to be worried about that is obviously our compassion and humanity about people coming to work and returning home safe and sound. The reality of recent legislative reforms is there's a real wish to reduce the coverage of those claims and look at the financial sustainability and so on. So that context was the reason for me to look at, in some recent research, a subset of those claims that relate to PID type processes. So what are the types of psychological injuries and experiences that tribunal data shows is connected to PID processes? So it's an imprecise science, and I'll say that very upfront, because when we are talking about tribunal decisions and the data that I have access to, those are decisions that have been disputed, run to a hearing, appealed or challenged. So there's a whole body of data that isn't reflected in this, but that research was first discussed at ICAC's National Investigation Symposium a few months ago, and essentially it's looking at every jurisdiction in Australia for decisions over the last 2 years related to investigation experiences. And some call-outs from that is, the first thing is that those kinds of injury claims can come from any perspective of an investigation. So there are examples of complainants or disclosures who have raised concerns within New South Wales government agencies and experienced harm associated with the subsequent events. There are claims on behalf of respondents or subject officers answering allegations of wrongdoing and their experiences of how that's played out. There are examples from witnesses or subjects of behaviour. One of the most stark of those comes from a few years ago in Queensland, where a person was the subject of inappropriate, intrusive photos in the workplace, and that was addressed through an internal misconduct type process in that agency, and that person was never informed or properly told what was going on. The logic being that these were covert photos that the person was not intended to know about, and so an entire process was conducted about these intrusive photographs without the person being aware. They subsequently became aware, and the injury they experienced about that lack of information and uncertainty was part of the claim. So it can come from any perspective of the types of processes we might conduct. And secondly, the discussion when we think about it as a legal claim is often around what is reasonable management action. That comes from workers' compensation legislation and the definition of when something will be compensable for a psychological injury. So what does that research show in terms of actual recovery and those decided decisions? There's 4 things that I wanted to call out. The first of those is that unexplained delay is harmful and unreasonable. And unexplained is really important there, and I'll move soon to thinking a bit more about trauma-informed practice expressly. But unexplained delay is the cause of harm in a body of those cases. So there's an example of 2 different cases from the Personal Injury Commission last year. Both New South Wales public servants told of an investigation process and then told there will be a delay prior to detailed allegations being issued to you. The first of those examples, there was a 2-month period where the subject officer was awaiting those particularised allegations. They were sexual harassment type matters, and during that period the officer was relocated to another workplace and subject to directions not to have one-on-one conversations with the opposite gender without being accompanied. In the second example, there was a period of 9 months delay between that initial notice of a process and the particularised allegations, and in both cases the employee subject officers experienced psychological injury and asserted that that period of time was unreasonable. Interestingly, it is the 2-month example that the tribunal felt was unreasonable. The 9-month example, the person had been updated, there had been intervening events, they had been told these are the contingencies that might impact. It related to vulnerable children giving information to the process, and so there were added reasonable considerations about how the agency could engage with those children and their families. So I give the example to say it's not a number, it's about unexplained delay and the need to have respectful information that tells people the plan, the contingencies that might change that plan, and has a respectful and trustworthy way of updating people and being reliable. The second sort of trend or identifiable theme from those cases is a growing expectation that processes need to account for the vulnerabilities of the particular people that you are dealing with in handling a disclosure or investigation matter. So that might be language needs, cultural needs, health needs, but it cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. You can have the most polished standard operating procedures of precise step-by-step guidance to your people, but they need to be flexible, they need to be responsive to the human needs and vulnerabilities of the particular participants in that particular situation. The third theme, and this is an error I see a lot, and I think with some reflection probably lawyers are the absolute worst, which is plain English communication, findings and transparency is absolutely key. We need to explain what is the proposition that we are examining. We can dress that up with all sorts of formal and complicated language, but in terms of meeting people and participants, having them understand, believe in that process, feel that it's transparent, feel that it's coherent, expressing that in a way that is straightforward, plain English, asks if it's understood and has an iterative process to make sure not just that I've sent a pretty letter that's elegant and well composed, but that it's been read and understood by the people that need to get that information. And then the final sort of theme from those reviews is around risk assessment about suspension and special leaves and those kind of interim arrangements that you might put in place. I mentioned the example of the 2-month period of delay, and that case example of a person being moved to another office subject to those directions. In that case, those arrangements were held to be unreasonable because there wasn't a sufficient explanation of where is the risk assessment and balanced objective set of considerations that support those sort of safety measures. It was a perception perhaps, and these are my words, that it was a knee-jerk thing of let's separate everyone, isolate people, that'll just be a prudent thing to do, without a balanced consideration of how that would impact the subject officer as well. So that's the research that perhaps prompted the invitation today and some of the background to thinking about trauma-informed practice in particular. And I wanted to just take a few moments to talk about that, I suppose, as a methodology or an insight that we are all benefiting from. So when we think about trauma-informed practice, a shorthand that's not very useful is being nice. And I hear that a bit, that's what we're talking about. It's sort of just being nicer and kinder and getting someone a cup of tea. And whilst I support getting people a cup of tea and being nice, that's not actually the insight that you need to take away from this kind of thinking. So first of all, it's a recognition, particularly from a health and sort of care sector point of view, of the impacts of trauma. And we don't necessarily mean an emergency or trauma in a sort of stylised TV sense. And I think when we apply this to sort of public interest disclosures, corruption, the types of themes that you might examine this week, the one that jumps out to me in terms of trauma is the idea of values conflict as a type of vicarious trauma, that many public servants are in it for a commitment to something very meaningful to them. And that is a commitment about serving the public interest, good government, the particular agency or group. You know, nobody's wrangling kindergarten kids at a public school with my kids this afternoon just for the money and prestige. There's a sense of purpose. And so I think in nearly every public interest disclosure scenario, there will be an element of values conflict of like, this isn't what I signed up for. This doesn't feel right, I don't want to be a part of this, that kind of thing. And so there's lots of other versions of trauma as well, but that's one of the ones that jumps out as almost universal for the processes we're talking about. And so the insights from this sort of health and care perspective is to say, let's understand the signs and symptoms of that and how people may respond and integrate it into policy, practice, and try and make sure what we do doesn't re-traumatise people or add to the problem. Excuse me for a moment. And a real difficulty with that insight is that the sorts of processes that, for reasons of procedural fairness and sort of information integrity, the investigation processes that we are going to recommend in many cases are themselves traumatic. So we know from work health and safety guidance in particular, where a lot of thinking around sexual harassment and how to investigate those types of matters has matured. We know that the guidance from Safe Work, for example, says investigation is both a hazard to people and a control measure to address risks to your people. So we need to have that comfort, and I think I said at the start of today that maybe this week is an initiative that enables some of the tricky and difficult things to be unpacked or tackled. We need to have that recognition that these processes are themselves traumatic. So we're trying to do as much as we can to make sure that the insights about centering people and protecting them as much as we can are informing our practice. On the slide there, I've shared a graphic from the Damogara stories from Larrakia in the Northern Territory. This is a sort of origin story of a lot of trauma-informed thinking, saying how do we make health services better? And that's about drawing on those understandings of culture and experience in that sector. So we're lucky enough in the sort of public integrity space to actually have, whether from that sexual harassment type regulation, cultural safety and Indigenous thinking or other fields, actually quite a sophisticated evidence base of how to do this well. And so the task then is to do it well in the context of our public interest disclosure practices and legislative regime. So if we unpack the behaviours of what we want in terms of trauma-informed practice, there are 5 things. The first is that we want to deliver safety. So that is both physical and emotional safety for the individuals engaged in our processes. Secondly, that we want to convey trust, and we want to build that trust through being transparent, clear, consistent, and also having that professional boundary of this is my role, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. And I think if I go back to that slightly flip remark I made about being nice, it's not about being nice necessarily building trust. It's about having that transparency of this is what you can rely on in this process. Thirdly, it's about choice, and where possible, giving people control and choices about how to participate and the circumstances for sharing information or assisting with a PID process. Fourthly, collaboration. So the idea of involving people in decision making and sharing power. And lastly, a sense of empowerment, that you would build people up and give support to advocacy and sort of self-development in these kinds of processes. So to call a spade, the last three of those are really difficult in a PID investigation, right? To say, I'm going to meet every person and participant in this matter and give them maximum choice. I'm going to collaborate and share power and involve people in decision making. I'm going to use this as a process to build sort of self-advocacy and skill development. These are not things that sit easily with an impartial, arm's length, fact-driven, robust, sort of procedurally fair process, a process that will withstand scrutiny of ICAC or a tribunal or a court should any of those things happen. So it is really, I think, a fair thing to really think about this as potentially intention and to think about what parts of the processes we are conducting at the moment are necessity, non-negotiable, can't be changed, and what things can we actually improve and reflect on and better meet people in terms of trauma-informed practice. A different challenge can sometimes be, who do we prioritise first? So a lot of those kinds of sentiments, if we think about it from the perspective of a respondent or subject officer, it is very reasonable to imagine that that person would say, I want to know who is the source of this information. I have sleepless nights looking around my colleagues thinking, who is the one that is saying that I've done the wrong thing? I am affronted by that. I am unable to work and relax and do my job when I know someone around here has accused me of this. It's very human, very understandable perspective. And I'm sure all of you immediately see the difficulty in meeting that need for transparency and trying to meet that person while at the same time respecting the necessary confidentiality of the process, protecting that complainant from detriment. So we need to bring compassion and empathy to these kinds of issues, but also I think really be honest about the fact that there's an interaction that we have to navigate. It's not as simple as simply adding this in to the processes we have already and resolving those exposures to psychological risk and harm that I gave you a bit of an overview of. So a tough one. Wanted to pause at that point and take a real tangent. There's probably not many of you in the audience who see yourselves as akin to aircraft engineers, but I wanted to share this just as a context set for this idea of speak up culture and how, rather than focusing on that individual disclosure, that whistleblower, the person, the hero that I asked you to be at the start of the session, how we can look more at that surrounding culture as being something that's going to deliver better support for people. So the relevance of the analogy to Boeing, many of you might be aware that there has been a fairly catastrophic history in the last little while around the 737 MAX aircraft in particular. The relevance of the analogy, I think, is probably a little clumsy, but very obvious that this is a business that relies on public trust. If you don't believe the plane is safe and sound and going to get you where you need to go, you're not going to jump on and have a great holiday. There's a high level of complexity. Building a plane, I understand, is not a straightforward thing. You need mass collaboration of technical experts from different fields coming together to make this aircraft. So I think you could stretch that to many different agencies in the public sector as well, that you are in the business of public trust. And I suppose added to that too, that failure can be pretty catastrophic. You can think of, in the Commonwealth sphere, robo-debt perhaps as an example that's akin to these plane crashes we're going to talk about in terms of miscarriage of what we'd expect. So there's been lots of analysis and sort of scrutiny of Boeing as an organisation. There are two key crashes, one in October 2018 of a 737 MAX in Indonesia. It killed 189 people. There was a further crash just a few months later in March of 2019 in Addis Ababa. More than 150 people were killed, and those were truly iconic tragedies. In addition to that, there are a range of other emergency events and things, and if you have the time to Google 737 Boeing events, it's horrifying to see that list of other occasions. Boeing have pleaded guilty to a criminal fraud in relation to both of those crashes. That's on the public record from mid-2024, and they have offered a nearly $500 million settlement payment in connection with that. So all of that's by way of context. Why am I talking about it in terms of PIDs? Because the process of scrutinising that has really identified that the failure to cultivate a speak-up culture around safety and irregularities in an organisation is perhaps the kernel of all of that tragedy. So there are some incredibly moving pieces of information from internal whistleblowers. One of those is from a few months before the first of those crashes. A senior manager on the production line writing an email to the head of the 737 program. He says, "I know how dangerous even the smallest of defects can be to the safety of an aeroplane. Frankly, right now, all my internal warning bells are going off, and for the first time in my life, I'm sorry to say that I'm hesitant about putting my family on a Boeing airplane." It goes on, and there's a bunch of technical concerns and specific matters. But the overall story of Boeing is that they had a great on-paper system. They had 1,000 people delegated with FAA safety oversight and checking. They had a very strong message: speak up, tell us what's going on. One of the very fundamental problems with that is that that speaking up did not connect to the board of that organisation, and there's truly quite shocking information that things like whistleblower complaints, safety metrics and so on just were not on the radar of the board of such an organisation. Their audit function, for example, was entirely oriented to financial and commercial risks, not safety risks. The same hierarchy of leadership and supervision was the hierarchy that you were meant to escalate concerns within. So tell your boss that you're not happy with your boss's oversight of safety on the production line of the 737. So the analogy, and I won't go into it too much, but I recommend the writing and talking about it, is that it is a huge omission to focus on the hero disclosure. It is a huge omission to not see that it is the ecosystem around that individual, the culture and systems and scaffolding that person writing that email saying, "I fear for my family," that is the game changer that will turn a policy ambition, a legislative aspiration in terms of public interest disclosures into a really effective culture. So in terms of the types of actions that I might suggest from that, culture is not an easy or quick fix, right? It's not a checklist that I can send each of you back to agencies with. And we naturally focus on disclosures. But I wanted to suggest, and I know there's been other speakers talking about speak up culture, and so maybe some of this will reinforce those earlier statements. But when we think about psychological safety and supporting individual disclosures, I think seeing that broader picture is something that is absolutely vital. So I wanted to share 5 examples from my own exposure and awareness of how different agencies tackle these things. And I suppose what I'm thinking about here is the difference between saying to someone, under Section 33 of the PID Act, you're protected, it's no problem, to having them believe you. when you say that. So the first of those ideas is the idea of having champions for certain subject matters or areas of practice. So this is something that Monash Council in Victoria have spoken public about, to not only have formal integrity reporting kind of institutional arrangements, but have people that are the advocates for good practice. Have people that are articulating these are ethical challenges and things we have to navigate day to day in government. Let's talk about it. I'm a beacon of somebody that is up to talk about it. Secondly, to interrogate patterns and PID reporting data in a really thoughtful way, and this is a really tricky one. So the Commonwealth jurisdiction published some data from the Ombudsman there recently that showed 123 agencies had reported no disclosures in the previous 6 months. And it jumped out to me a few weeks ago because I think, well, is no news good news? Or is that a sign that there is a negative culture around those things? So it's not an easy thing to say, interrogate that data and think about it, but it's certainly something that we need to do to build that bigger culture. Thirdly is to think about the accountability of leaders and senior executives in particular. And on that front, I've seen a lot of position descriptions or role capabilities or even the work level standards that have some very fluffy ambitions in terms of lead a pro-integrity culture and manage these matters well. And so my challenge there is to think about what actually is the behaviour that we expect to see underlying that. Not to impose a no news is good news or a sort of, once you're a senior public servant, you must know what you're doing about these things, but to actually create that accountability and specific behaviours and things that we want from those executives. The fourth thing is to think about the integrity function within an organisation, and obviously this is not in all of our control, but to think about the effectiveness of that from an organisational design point of view. Does that team have cut through to the right people? Does that team report through a range of levels where things get filtered or massaged in a way that dilutes the message? And then the final point is to make sure there's messaging that cuts through. One of the absolutely remarkable things about New South Wales Government is the diversity and dispersed nature of the services that we provide all over the state and all different types of work types and expertise. And so the message that works to the cohort of lawyers in the city is not necessarily the message that is going to cut through and be effective across an agency. One of the examples that I'm aware of from government department in Victoria is if it doesn't look right or you're not sure, speak up. A very kind of plain English message, which might be quite different to the definition that you would tell to the messaging you would have to a group of city lawyers. So those are the final comments I'll say on that big cultural sort of big picture piece. As I said, I'm aware that you've got other speakers who have got great credit on that front this week already, but I just wanted to, I guess, put that out there as a counterpoint to this idea of the hero disclosure that I mentioned at the start. So that brings me to the sort of final section of the remarks I wanted to make, which is to step through 8 areas of sort of practice and challenge in handling PIDs where I think trauma-informed practice and the insights that I've alluded to can help improve how we manage these processes. So the first of those is about that first reception of a disclosure. And just to remind you, when we were going over those touchstones of trauma-informed practice, safety and trust were the first 2 things, the things that I think in every stage of handling a PID we can deliver. So having a reception of a disclosure that is calm, respectful and measured is a real challenge, because one of the features of our legislation is that essentially every manager is potentially receiving a PID. In accordance with the legislation, we've created this real expectation of no wrong door, and that is a fabulous thing, because we don't want to say you didn't fill in the right form, you didn't tick the right box, so we're ignoring something important that needs to be heard. But the consequence of that is that we have differential capability across agencies and across people, and a heightened risk of missed PIDs or PIDs that lack visibility at the right levels. So that first sort of reception is really important. And I think one of the insights that I would offer, it's a really simple one, which is just thinking and reflecting on the language that you have at your disposal for that kind of conversation. So that it doesn't come out of your mouth, why didn't you tell me sooner? I'm sure they didn't mean that. You can't raise it if you can't prove it. Asking all of this is not fitting to your management or leadership role. This is not the type of, alignment we want to see in this agency. The, managing director would want to see a different kind of team morale. Just making sure that that messaging doesn't slip into, geez, this is really uncomfortable and I really need to have certainty myself before I wish to progress the matter. Because the threshold concept in terms of making a PID disclosure is about honest, reasonable grounds and that belief in wrongdoing. It's not about, do you believe the person? Do you know it to be true? Can you prove it today? So having that willingness to listen with purpose and understanding the threshold is really, really important. And one of the things that I see from time to time is this error that the gateway of being taken seriously or respected as a disclosure is, do I believe you? And that's a really mistaken approach to that sort of first phase of disclosure. The other thing in terms of thinking about that values conflict and trauma is to think about the significance of that decision to raise concerns. And on that front, I wanted to cast your mind to Robodebt again. And a key person that kind of came out of the Royal Commission there was a woman called Colleen Taylor. Some of you may know her name now. She's an APS4 person from Centrelink in the compliance team, perhaps not destined for fame when we cast on back to 2017, but a real upstander and someone who's been sort of celebrated in the aftermath of that. And in preparation for today, I wanted to just read you the opening words of a key email that she wrote. So she was one of the earliest people to call out and recognise the wrongdoing that was going on. She sent an email to her manager. It was very respectful. It opened, "As a loyal Centrelink employee of many years standing, I trust that you will respectfully consider my views. I am concerned about the impact on the mental health of not only our customers but our staff." And 6 days later, she got a very constructive reply from her manager, "Thank you for raising these concerns," etc., etc. And then within a further week, that manager had been removed and reassigned from the role. She was stuck there. She then received an all-staff email from the secretary of that department and penned a, I think, 17-page response to the secretary. And it had some of the features that people with experience in this field might be familiar with as a bit troubling. There was some red text, there was some all capitals, there was some underlying, there were some features that in a sort of callous view you might think, oh, this is a bit escalated. But the words of that, again, are really moving. "Please allow me, as a loyal employee of many years standing who has only ever raised concerns in-house, to respond to you directly, as your statement tells me that you are being misled, and I want to ensure my words reach you. We cannot find a solution if the problem is not correctly identified. It is possible we are not even looking in the right direction for a solution." And it goes on to very methodically and carefully explain the concerns and the, now we know, unlawful conduct that was going on. So I share those just to kind of pull the heartstrings a bit to say that's the level of thinking and angst that might be sitting behind that initial disclosure. The next point I wanted to make is around reasoned implementation of care, support and interim arrangements. And this goes back to that era of thinking that trauma-informed practice is being nice. And the other side of that coin is that impartiality, having a neutral and robust process, doesn't mean being disconnected or inhuman or callous towards the people that are participating in that process. So I think we need to have a willingness to acknowledge impact and experience and to put words around that recognise that sincerely held beliefs are a heavy weight for that person to share with you. And so to acknowledge that impact and experience is not to admit a level of bias or lack of impartiality. It's a human connection. And I think from that point, one of the really robust things you can do is have a division of responsibilities to ensure that the right support is available to individuals in a PID process. So if you're a subject officer receiving allegations or waiting to receive those allegations, you need a wellbeing contact. You need somebody you can ask about questions and timeframes in the investigation. You perhaps need someone to talk about management and operational arrangements to mitigate perceptions of detriment or whatever else. And having that division of labour of who's who in the zoo and whose role it is to help in what way is something that is really going to help in terms of supporting all of the individuals in that process to avoid psychological harm. I mentioned as one of the insights from that case review that I had done that sort of tailoring processes is increasingly an expectation in terms of the workers' comp decisions. I just wanted to flag one example from that, which is a Comcare decision from earlier this year. PKZS is the acronym de-identified in that matter. It related to an individual who had a history of family violence and mental ill health. The department was aware of that. When a disciplinary matter needed to be progressed, some of those issues related to a perceived intimate or romantic relationship in the workplace. So it was inherently sensitive to some of that history. Out of a consideration of privacy, sensitivity, caution, the manager delegated to communicate with that subject officer, advise them of the investigation, advise them of the allegations, was not briefed with any of that history. They weren't told of those particular vulnerabilities of the person. They experienced a psychological injury in connection with the subsequent process, and the Commonwealth Tribunal held that that was not a reasonable approach, that the person implementing the planned investigation step-by-step process, which was used sort of cookie cutter for every investigation in that agency, that plan needed to be reviewed and adjusted for the particular needs of that individual. This matter also occurred during COVID, and another factor was thinking about the isolation and remote working arrangements during that period. So I think that potential for collision between trauma-informed sort of best practice and those guardrails that come from health and care contexts often comes from trying to be all things to all people. In that example, it wasn't necessary, and this was an argument that was run and rejected, it wasn't necessary for the investigator to be briefed with all those details. It wasn't necessary for that to be agitated in the formal treatment of the concerns, but it was necessary for the process to be planned and respectfully adjusted and flexibly applied to recognise those particular needs. The next practical matter is to be really clear about confidentiality, and this is a topic in and of itself. I'm just going to make some brief remarks. The first of all is to make sure that people understand confidential does not mean secret in the sense of you control this information. And that is something that those of us who practice in this area a lot are very comfortable with. But if you are unfamiliar, nervous and anxious about this kind of process, you may not have a clear understanding. That anonymity is not absolute or universal. And I think if we are managing processes thinking, I've de-identified the person, job done, we're going to miss important actions to safeguard people from detriment and also to build that trust by transparency and to actually show we've thought about the scenario of you being reasonably identified by inference or whatever else. This is the approach to documents or otherwise that we're going to take. And to also explain the multiple purposes of confidentiality. And there can be a perception that running a confidential process is about keeping bad news under wraps, and I can understand that and I can respect that perception. However, it's also a practice that is protective in terms of detriment, that is protective in terms of workplace sort of gossip and pressure and other sorts of things. So addressing the sort of practical reasons why a process is confidential is also vital. And I think on that front, in particular, I think having the courage to listen and have a conversation about that rather than solely issue directions to participants is a really important shift, informed by some of the ideas that I'm sharing. Because if you have a conversation about confidentiality where the person says, I'm in angst and distress, can I talk to my husband about this? Or I've got a counsellor, can I talk to them? Or I've got a big project with Joe Blogs in that team, I don't want to step out of it. You're telling me that these interim arrangements are for my protection, but actually I think if I'd step out of that, that would ask more questions. To have actually a conversation about what are the practical implementations of confidentiality is a more courageous thing and a more protective measure. Exactly the kind of adjustment that you would think about in terms of personalised process. The last couple of points go on to kind of building that sense of transparency. So explaining a process and interim arrangements simply. And I've put on the slide there that policies are scaffolding and it's the explanation that builds belief. So if I throw a document across the table, the difference between actually explaining and articulating that is usually very material. One of the examples that I think is quite striking relates to some findings that were reviewed by a tribunal in New South Wales, where the tribunal member said, I don't know what this individual has done wrong. I've read the report, I've read the allegations letters, I've read the reasonings and findings of these investigators, and in my view it is telling that I am not able to definitively identify from the letters advising the applicant of the allegations or the outcome what actions on what particular days are the alleged misconduct and what the nature of that misconduct was. And that goes to that plain English direction I mentioned before. So explaining things in a way that is understood and confirming that it is understood, it takes time, but it is repaid in terms of trust and integrity of process. The sixth item is around offering choices where possible, and I think I flagged that early on as a particular area where there is a potential collision. Offering open choice to any participant in a PID process is something that is inevitably going to cause collisions between those individual interests. But small choices can really reinforce autonomy, and there are lots of choices we can give to people in terms of where we meet and how to present information, who's there to support them, what approach in terms of setting an agenda or questions or whatever else. And so I think that is something that we can do more on without falling into error. It is an area where one of the things I've observed, and it's perhaps a hard message, is that allowing misunderstandings or misapprehensions or a convenient interpretation, and confidentiality is a great one, knowing that someone's walked out of the room thinking that you're not going to identify them and there is no way for them to be identified, even though technically, you know, I didn't say that, but they walked away with that impression. Having the courage to address those misunderstandings and ensure that there is clarity at the time is really essential, because what I've seen in experience is that when you allow those misunderstandings to mature, you have a real reckoning and something that is very psychologically hazardous for the person 3 or 6 months later when they realise that they have been sort of duped or impliedly miscarried in terms of what their expectations were. And I think that concept of autonomy and choice is also a really simple thing about stopping. If somebody is not fit and able to participate in a process, to understand that the priority on their well-being and fitness has to be absolute, that you can't allow somebody to volunteer themselves for something that will put them in trauma and damage them even further. The last 2 points I'd like to make are about follow-through. The first of those is time frames. Trust is built on reliability, and I made that point at an earlier stage. That is not time or delay in and of itself that is the most obvious risk, although of course that's a factor. It's about that reliability and explanation. So if things change, explain. And we know that the sort of target timeframes for complex matters are really lengthy periods of time for somebody to be in a state of uncertainty. So in the PID Act, we have this investigation period of 6 months. That's not a code, but it triggers certain rights for the disclosure. And in ICAC materials, there's a benchmark of 16 months for a standard investigation. So I'm not suggesting that those numbers are rigid, but we're talking about a significant period of time of uncertainty and rumination potentially on what might happen. So the very simple point on timeframes is to have that integrity of explanation, to explain the contingencies, and to make sure that that division of labour I referred to earlier, that role of wellbeing support, process support, investigator, is absolutely clear on sort of who's doing what in terms of maintaining those timeframes. And then the final point in terms of follow through is, what is the purpose of all of this? Cycling back to the points I made right at the start of this session, is that the purpose of the PID regime is not to punish individuals or to create heroic disclosures. It's actually to protect the public interest and improve good government. And so the call to action to have remedial actions, to actually implement and integrate those with other things going on within your agency, to report the insights of a process to the right teams that need that information, is absolutely the cardinal purpose of why we have this regime and what we hope to come from sort of shining a bright light on troubling information. And in that area, something that I see from time to time is a real reticence to show visible safeguarding of individuals in connection with the process. Obviously, there are limitations on that, but where possible to say, we put our money where our mouth is, this is how we protect people, or there were errors made and this is how we've changed our practice, is really something that will build that trust. And that brings me to the final point, which is a really straightforward one too, which is word of mouth and how people experience these matters, whether it's their experience of going to a manager saying, something a bit sus about this, I don't know if I should raise concerns, whether it's the experience of their friend or peer going to investigation interviews and coming back red-faced, teary and unable to communicate. Whatever points of contact create that word of mouth about the type of culture within our public service is one of the most powerful for good or powerful for bad in terms of building this speak-up culture. And we know that misconduct and corruption thrives when it's not called out, when people look the other way and step around or sweep under the carpet. And so I think that idea of creating a powerful ally in that broader culture, and the comments that I made, learning from sort of Boeing and what can go wrong, is one of the most important trauma-informed things you can do, because you are creating an environment where an individual doesn't have the world on their shoulders. They're in an environment of shared public responsibility to raise concerns and to deal with them. So those were the comments that I had today. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If there are any, I'd be very happy to chat to any points, or otherwise let you get on with your day. Thanks.
Okay, we do have one question from online, which is asking about the platform or how someone would go about sounding out the validity or the foundation for their disclosure before they move through to make it, noting that there can be personal and emotional clouding of thought in relation to the claim combined with the general stress. So really asking if you've seen any examples or opportunities for someone to fact test or check a disclosure before they go forward and make it either to an agency or an integrity agency.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I think I called out that definition of a PID being honest on reasonable grounds, but the question kind of alludes to stress testing your own thinking about whether those reasonable grounds and coherence of thinking. And so I think one of the obvious things is if you have a climate where integrity issues are part of business as usual discussion, that should be a more approachable thing to do, right? Because if you're in an environment where leaders say, oh yeah, we have to engage with ethical problems, we have to navigate and stress test, is this the right thing? Should we do more in terms of public integrity or conflicts of interest or whatever it might be? If you're in that culture, then you have peers and managers and others to talk about those matters. Now, perhaps that's a bit idealistic, and I think the question might allude to some really tricky things where you're actually under legal and professional obligations to keep information confidential, but you have an impulse to tell and test with others. And I think it would really sort of tread into error if somebody went too far in terms of outside disclosure or testing of that thinking. And then the final point I'd make about that, and I'm conscious I might sound a little bit too optimistic, is you can be wrong, and that's not a bad thing. Having a culture where people say, it doesn't feel right, it looks sus, it's over the line, I'm genuinely saying this, it might be a genuine and mistaken belief, and ideally, that's a good thing, right? It goes back to those agencies with 0 reports. Do we go 0 reports, job done, or do we go, maybe we should be bringing more things to the surface? Okay, thank you all for having me today. It's been a pleasure, and happy to chat more afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for sharing your perspectives on how we can take a trauma-informed approach to supporting a psychologically safe environment for disclosures. I'm privileged to provide the closing remarks for this year's PID Awareness Week. I'd first like to thank everyone who has participated in this year's week and for taking the time to be part of this important initiative. As was reflected across the range of panel sessions we held this week, PID awareness and understanding and supporting a speak-up culture can only happen with the support and engagement of people at all levels of our organisations. We are thrilled this week to have had almost 800 attendees from a broad range of agencies, attending both in-person and online events. More will access the videos of the sessions in their own time, which will be posted on our website shortly. I'd particularly like to thank our panellists who gave up their time to provide valuable and insightful thoughts and share unique perspectives, personal and professional, with us. I'd like to take a few moments to reflect on some of the key themes and insights from the week, and then to think about where to from here. Over the course of the week, we've spoken about PID in detail, the PID framework, how to make a PID, and what support services are available. We've spoken about why the PID framework exists and key characteristics of any good PID policy, such as accessibility, the commitment to confidentiality, support for employees involved in the PID process, and protections for those who speak up. We've heard insights across the public sector, including from ICAC, the LEC, the Office of the Public Service Commissioner, the Information and Privacy Commission, the Audit Office, Customer Service, Education, Health, Justice, and of course the New South Wales Ombudsman. A key point in that is that the PID scheme and agencies more broadly can only be effective if public officials have the courage to come forward about serious wrongdoing and are supported when they do. A critical and fundamental theme that echoed across all our conversations this week is that the PID Act provides the framework to report wrongdoing. This is important, but what is crucial, however, and what we ultimately aspire towards, is to work together to drive a speak-up culture in New South Wales and to embed this in our organisation's DNA. As I said at the beginning of the week, our culture and our values sit at the heart of our responsibilities as public officials. What has clearly come out of the discussions over the week is that managing public interest disclosures and embedding a speak-up culture can be complex, sensitive and challenging. It requires a nuanced approach and an ongoing, long-term and organisational-wide support and commitment. This week, Privacy Commissioner Sonia Minutello reminded us of the importance of trust, that trust is our institutions and government is not a given, and that once it's diminished, it's incredibly difficult to get back. In the PID context, trust is central both at the macro and at the individual level. An overall commitment to confidentiality, for example, is crucial to protect the reporter as much as possible and the PID process overall. But those working in the field know it's also important to be realistic with people who make a public interest disclosure, to effectively manage their expectations about what their PID will be how their PID will be dealt with and what the outcome may be. It's important that perhaps more than the outcome, we trust the integrity of the process that sits behind it. Another theme expressed across the week is that while the PID Act provides a framework, the integrity of what we do relies on organisational cultures that ensure people are comfortable having a voice, even if it's different from what's considered the norm. We need organisational cultures that permit respectful and safe challenge and debate. As Public Service Commissioner Katharina Lowe observed, we can experience ethical blind spots when we feel obligated to conform to organisational thinking. We can mitigate these partially by encouraging a culture that wants to hear other viewpoints and diverse views, where people understand a safe and respectful way to challenge and respond to when challenged. Being safe to speak is more than just protection from detrimental action. But we know that dealing with PIDs and the speak up culture more broadly operates in a complex organisational context. It is by no means easy and requires ongoing commitment. Commissioner of the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, Anina Johnson, reminded us to recognise a human element involved in PIDs, that many of us have complex, challenging and demanding roles. It can be hard to challenge systems where your colleague has designed or made a complaint about someone you know. In this context, it's important that whether we have delegated responsibilities or simply as managers and colleagues, that we listen with an open mind. DCS Secretary Graham Head made the point that speaking up doesn't begin and end with the PID Act, and that we must be sufficiently curious in our approach to our work. Regularly asking questions and challenging ourselves. If we are regulators, for example, are we stopping to ask ourselves if our approach is right? Do we correctly understand the limits of our power? From a leadership point of view, it's clear that the differences across and within our organisations mean that there should be no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to cultivating a culture that supports speaking up. Nor is it a set and forget. Building organisational culture is complex, challenging, and a commitment that requires resourcing, communication, and a continual focus. Our panellists suggested some practical entry points to this. A key point of agreement is to focus on the basics and consider whether, at the leadership level, we have clear and accessible disclosure systems in place. Are we making sure it is clear that there is no wrong door? Are we adequately resourcing these and communicating them across the organisation? Featuring integrity issues at Town Hall, for example, and in individual, team and leadership meetings can be an entry point to this. Are we creating the opportunity for our people to be heard? Are we recruiting people managers whose behaviours align with the character we want to see in our organisation? Are we requiring our leaders to show how they are building an inclusive culture? Other practical measures include adequate and relevant training, facilitating scenario-based discussions with teams, allowing people to have divergent views during these discussions. Ask key probing questions. What if it were me in this scenario? What could we do to prevent it? Walking the walk as leaders, and even commending someone who speaks up, publicly if appropriate, but otherwise personally. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a couple of insights shared by our panellists about the importance of PIDs, regardless of the outcome. Commissioner of the Independent Commission Against Corruption, Helen Murrell, shared that PIDs are a core of ICAC work and provide key intelligence to help integrity agencies do what they do. Public officials can always make a disclosure to an integrity agency if uncomfortable reporting it within their agency. The Privacy Commissioner reminded us that PIDs, regardless of the outcome, can give us big picture insight into systems, processes or practices, and where these are misaligned, help to take action before something becomes an even bigger problem. Integrity of the public sector needs us all to speak up about serious wrongdoing. There is no wrong door. Please don't let PID discussions end this week. Some touch points I'd like to leave with are that the videos of each sessions will be available on YouTube, and we will send links to all attendees in the next week. We will also draw together all the questions asked throughout the week's sessions and put them together to send to attendees. There are a series of short information videos on our YouTube channel too that may be useful in raising awareness across the public sector and in your own agencies. As social media influencers say, make sure you like and subscribe. Please continue to engage with us. The New South Wales Ombudsman has a dedicated public interest disclosure support team. We have a range of materials and guidelines available on our website, and we can help with training too. Also remind that people with PID responsibilities can also contact our office at pid@ombo.nsw.gov.au, and you can join the PID community of practice. And lastly, our whistleblower support team is available to provide an independent source of support for officials who are considering making a PID or have made a PID. You can get in touch with them at whistleblowersupport@ombo.nsw.gov.au. So with that, thank you for participating this week and bringing your insights, questions, ideas and courage to be part of the conversation. We look forward to continued dialogue and engagement across the public sector and embedding a speak up culture in our organisational DNA. Thank you.